They decide that the best way in is down this Slaughter Valley, up this 500-foot cliff, which was like scaling a skyscraper in the middle of winter, and then go down those railroad tracks, break into the plant there, and then access the plant through an air duct system. And so they crawl through this air duct tunnel, drop down in the heart of the plant, and they plant the bombs.
Welcome to My Nuclear Life. I'm Shelly Lesher. Today I have author Neal Bascomb on the show to discuss one of his books, The Winter Fortress, the epic mission to sabotage Hitler's atomic bomb. Like Neal, I noticed the small mention of Operation Gunnerside in Richard Rhodes' book, Making of the Atomic Bomb. Unlike Neal, I did not dedicate hundreds or even thousands of hours of my time in the archives conducting interviews and writing about the mission. But I am so very grateful that Neal did. Today on the podcast, you will hear the basic outlines of the multiple missions set out to destroy Germany's ability to obtain heavy water from the Norse Hydro plant in Norway and the very brave men behind these missions. However, you still need to buy this book. It's a great read, and there is so much more information about these missions and the people involved. Those involved extend beyond the commandos that we talk about, but also to their families, the civilians in the countryside, and many, many more brave men and women who risked their lives and their livelihoods to protect and fight for Norway during this time. What we have to talk about first before we talk about heavy water is the Norwegian resistance. And was there a kind of large Norwegian resistance, or was it a few people? And was it just in the country, or were people leaving the country to be trained?
The Germans came there, occupied, which was all sudden and out of the blue. Like, there was no expectation that this was going to happen. And people's reactions to it ran the gamut, just like they ran the gamut in most of the countries that Nazis ended up occupying. Some people resisted with armed force, like our saboteurs. There were many Norwegians in the hundreds and below thousands who made their way generally by boat, sometimes by plane, to England, and then found themselves recruited by the Special Operations Executive, which is the British secret services, secret operations behind enemy lines. So they were trained as active SOE agents, and they were part of this company called Company Ling. And for the purposes of Winter Fortress, that's where many of these individuals came from, all of them actually, except for the leader of it, Leif Tronstad. Then, of course, there were people who helped the resistance, the more active resistance, with providing lodging, providing secret caches, any sort of assistance that they could provide. Then there were people who were sort of more passive resistors. They just were not willing to help the Nazis, sometimes did small rebellions like putting pins on their shirts and the like. Then there were many people who just went along to go along. Well, this is the new world, this is the new life, and so I have a family to feed, and it's a hard thing to take on. And then there were people, the Quislings, which is actually from Norway, who actively participated and helped the Nazis. And so I would say that the range, if you were to draw a bell curve, you have the left end with the people who actively went to England and came back to fight, to the other end where the people who were actively participating in the government and helping the Germans and fully aligned with them. And then everything else was sort of in the middle.
And your story.
I appreciate you taking ownership. No, that's what I want people to do, right? To feel invested.
When you read the book, you really feel invested.
Good.
And shocked a lot of times. There's a few characters in this book that are inanimate objects, and one is the Norse hydro plant.
Correct.
And what is this plant used for, and where is it?
So the lowdown on the plant is the Norwegians built this hydroelectric plant several hundred miles west of Oslo, in the sort of wilds of Norway. And it was sort of the perfect location for that. There was sort of a tremendous amount of water that was coming from the highlands, the Vida, and flowing down into the valley where Vemork was located. And so they built this hydroelectric plant there. And one of the individuals who worked for Norsk Hydro was Leif Tronstad. And he was a chemist. And he decided that you had all this power and you had all this water. And there was this new thing discovered called heavy water. And no one was really producing it at industrial scale. And so he decided that they should build this heavy water plant within the Norsk Hydro hydroelectric plant. Now, in terms of giving the sense of where it is, the plant is perched on the edge of this cliff in this valley right outside this town called Rjukan. And it's very steep slopes up, which is where the water comes down from. Then you have this steep valley, which is crossed by a single-lane suspension bridge. So it's all this deep slotted valley. And then just beyond that is what I just mentioned, the Vida, which is thousands of square miles of frozen tundra during the wintertime. And basically it's uninhabitable unless you're really hardy. And there's very little food out there. There's only really reindeer to survive off of. The title of the book is The Winter Fortress, and that's exactly what it was. I mean, the plant itself is stone and steel leviathan perched on this cliffside and then surrounded by sort of icy tundra. It is a very foreboding place that I spent a good deal of time at, and I can attest to the fact that it gets very cold for a good share of the year.
And you described the other inanimate object that plays a big part in the book, which is the Vida.
Yes. The Vida was a place, as I just described, this uninhabitable frozen tundra. I mean, there's really no other way to put it. There's a sort of legend in Norway that it gets so cold so fast that flames freeze in the fire. Now, that's slightly apocryphal, but that gives you the sense of what a frigid place it is and what a hard place it is to live. The people in Rjukan would access it to ski and go hiking and camping. You have to be a sort of expert outdoors person to deal with that habitat.
Yeah, it certainly did not sound like a nice place to hang out, not in the winter.
No, I went cross-country skiing there with some of Knut Haugland, who was the Norwegian radio operator on the mission, with two of his sons. And all I can say is, wow.
And you had modern gear.
I had semi-modern gear. I was wearing, maybe I shouldn't be revealing this. I was wearing Knut Haugland's long underwear because apparently whatever I brought that I had bought at the local outdoor shop, Haugland's sons just sort of laughed at it and passed me their father's long underwear. And it's like, you're better off with this. That's how far I go to get to the authenticity of these stories. Wearing someone else's underwear.
It's good to know. It's good to know.
Good.
So the heavy water is starting to be produced at this hydro plant. When did Tronstad start realizing that something was going on in the world, that heavy water was important somehow?
Well, there was this sort of bubbling up of research in the early 30s related to heavy water and what its potential uses were. And it was primarily through scientific research. Some people believe that the use of the heavy water could help treat cancer and other maladies. Other people thought that it could be used in a variety of industrial products and uses. The market for it, after Tronstad built it in the mid-1930s, was not robust, I think is the best way of putting it. They spent all this time and effort to create this industrial capacity to produce heavy water, And really no one wanted it in the quantities that they were producing it. And so the joke around Rjukan was that the heavy water's really best and only use was to create skating rinks because it froze at a higher temperature. So it was kind of a joke. It was a bust. Nobody was interested in it. Tronstedt sort of backed away from it. And then you have, of course, in 1939 and then into 1940, the discovery that, hey, this heavy water might be useful in the research of and pursuit of nuclear science. And specifically as a moderator for building a heavy water reactor. I don't know how schooled your listeners are in heavy water, but just to give a little sense of these things. So you have obviously regular water, right? And then you have D2O or heavy water, which is essentially an isotope of hydrogen that has a neutron in its nucleus where regular hydrogen does not. And so that gives it more mass, makes it heavier. Am I getting that right so far?
Yep.
Excellent.
You're doing good.
Okay. I have to say, I must have written the nuclear science of this story 10 times because your instinct is to sort of over-explain it, right? And to get into the really deep, I mean, you can go forever, right?
Yeah.
And the challenge was to try to describe it in a way that normal layperson reader would read it.
Without their eyes glazing over.
Eyes glazing over. And again, this is not a nuclear textbook. Like, that was never its intention. But it's important to know what heavy water does because the whole story is based around it. So what they essentially found out was that these nuclear reactors to convert regular uranium to create plutonium, which could be used in nuclear bombs, they needed to have the neutrons that were sort of flinging around a reactor to slow enough so that it helped foster the chain reactions. And they really had two ways of doing that. They could use graphite, which the Americans ended up using to great success in Chicago in the first self-sustaining nuclear reactor. But the Germans, during the time of this story, did not believe the graphite would work because, as the Americans had found out, the graphite had impurities in it, specifically boron, that helped stop it from working effectively. The Americans managed to basically purify the graphite to such a level that that was not the case, and it could help in moderating the flinging of the neutrons. The Germans did not believe graphite would work. They thought that heavy water would, because of the deuterium, that it would help slow the flinging around. And so right when the war started in 1940s, the Germans were desperate for heavy quantities of heavy water. And that is the sort of impetus of this whole story. The French intelligence knew this, and right before Germans came, they secured a lot of heavy water from Norway from this factory. But then when the Germans came, they needed it, and so it becomes the sort of locus of this whole story.
And the Germans do everything they can to increase the production of this heavy water.
They do. They come into Norway. They seize the country within a week in 1940. And one of the first things they did is send a small army to Rjukan, to the Norsk Hydro plant, secure it, and then begin sending in their scientists to figure out a way to increase the production of the heavy water and increase the size of the plant. They did various other things, all in that effort.
Was this one of the main reasons that Germany wanted Norway during the war, or were there other reasons?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't say it was the sort of primary reason. They wanted to basically secure that area of the North Sea. But that said, Norway was known to be very rich in natural resources. And so heavy water, the production of it was sort of a sidelight of that. But other minerals and chemicals and the rest, Norway produced in great quantities. And so the Germans wanted that.
What I found really interesting throughout this story is the level of concern that the Norwegians had for keeping this plant up and running after the war because it was such an important part of their economy. So making sure that the English knew not to destroy it, not to bomb it, because it was a fertilizer plant primarily.
Correct. Yes.
And so they favored the sabotage over bombing because the bombing wouldn't work. But they were so concerned about keeping their economy safe after the war. And this plant was a big part of that. So could you talk about what the workers did inside the building to sabotage the production of the heavy water before kind of this big sabotage effort outside happened?
Yeah. One, they did not work robustly, sort of normal reluctance to work, but they also basically poisoned the heavy water. And this was all led by Leif Tronstad. There was another reason that one of the most active things done to slow production was for Leif to leave town and to escape to Britain, because he was the brains behind the operation. He's the one who created the plant. And so by virtue of him just not being there, that was also a hobbler of what happened. To your point about not bombing the plant, it was really Leif Tronstad who did everything in his power, which was limited, to prevent the British or the Americans from bombing the plant. And again, one of the key reasons was because he knew that this was an important part of the Norwegian economy. But two, he knew the plant inside and out. He knew how it was built, that the heavy water factory was inside at the heart of this plant, and the fact that this slotted valley in which it was located was really hard to bomb. And if you did bomb it to effectiveness, you would basically have to destroy the town of Rjukan, where 5,000 Norwegians lived. And so he was unwilling to accept that collateral damage for putting this plant out of commission. And the fact is, eventually the Americans and the British did end up trying to bomb it after one of the key sabotage operations, and they were unsuccessful, as he predicted they would be.
So let's get to the...
But I'm getting ahead of myself.
Yeah, I was going to say, they eventually did bomb it and nothing happened to the heavy water. So he was right.
Correct.
You've set the scene that you have this fortress on top of a valley. So there wasn't a lot of defenses needed kind of on that side. And then you have this footbridge going in, so it's hard to access the plant. And then you mentioned that the heavy water facility is located on the inside of the plant. And then you can't bomb it out of existence. Well, you could, but it would cost a lot of lives. So sabotage is the only way to get to it.
Exactly. And even that was a challenge. You couldn't really just walk across the bridge. It had machine gun nests on either side, Nazi guards. They had planted bombs throughout the hillside to prevent anyone from coming down along the water pipes. Those were also guarded. They had dogs. So it was very fortified, very well guarded. It was thought to be impossible. And the Germans felt that way, that there was no way anyone could destroy this place.
So what was the first attempt? Because there were multiple attempts to sabotage.
Yeah, so I'll start with Tronstad again, because he is the sort of leader of this mission. Right after the Germans invaded, he went underground, part of the resistance, decided he could be more effective. He was providing the British with intelligence related to Norsk Hydro plant and the heavy water, saying, you got to pay attention to this. The Germans are here. They're very interested in increasing production. That message was only marginally getting through. And so he decided he has to go over to Britain to get these people to pay attention. And so he does that, right? And he was just a remarkable individual. He was a sort of true patriot, very, very, very intelligent, a great teacher, and then ended up becoming, when he left for England, quickly found himself as a sort of adjunct to the SOE related to Norway, and really the leader of it. And so he urged the British that something needed to be done about this plant. They said, well, great, we'll bomb it. And he's like, no, as I discussed already. And so then it became a question of, okay, we need to send people in there to destroy it. Tronstad wanted Norwegians to do that because he's like, we've already described what the Vita was like. He thought that Norwegians trained as saboteurs would be very effective. The British, being British, thought that they could do it best, just like most countries probably feel that way, that their own people are the best. And so they say, no, we're going to have British special commandos go in relative force, break into the plant, go in, plant bombs inside the heavy water factory, and then get out. And so the British leadership won that fight with Tronstad. So this operation called Operation Freshman was launched. As part of that, the one sort of opening they gave to Tronstad was he could send 4 Norwegians who had been trained by the SOE to go to land in Norway as an advance team and sort of set the stage for the operation, set out the lights for the landing, and prepare for the mission. And there was really a 5th guy named Einar Skinnerland, who's probably one of my favorite people in this whole story, who, even before these 4, actually took over a ship, steamed it to England. Leif Tronstad heard that there was this Norwegian from the Rjukan area, recruited Einar to train quickly. So he was trained within weeks to parachute back into Norway and be the advance team for the advance team, providing intelligence on everything about the plant, how it was guarded by the Nazis, and then to assist this 4-man team, which was called Operation Grouse, to prepare for the British commandos. So that sort of sets the stage for the initial operation.
So how long was the Grouse team on land before the freshman mission came in? Like, how advanced was the advanced team?
The British commandos need to get there, right? And can't really take a ship there, so they have to parachute in. You can't land a plane in this area. It's, like I said, it's rocky, and the terrain is uneven and pocked with holes, and so you can't land a plane there, really. So they decided they would use gliders that would be launched off planes, and these gliders would land in the Vita, and then these British commandos would then descend on the plant. The reason the whole operation was called Operation Freshman was because these gliders had never been used in a combat operation before.
Oh, no.
So it was a tricky wicket, I think is the expression. So you need really good weather to, fly over Norway at this time, as well as to land these gliders. So, it has to be sort of clear and not windy. And the thing about the Vita was that the weather changed on a dime. So you could very rarely predict it. So Grouse goes in, and they're on the ground. They go up. They're within the area, radioing Britain on what the weather's like every day. And time again, there just was no clearing. So it ended up these guys were there for several months. But finally, the great night comes where the weather's clear. Newt Hogland, who I mentioned, radioed Britain and said, let's go. It's the time to write. And the thing about this Operation Grouse team is they were all from this area. That was the other key thing that Leif Tronstad wanted to do. He wanted people who were locals, who knew the terrain, who were expert cross-country skiers, who were hunters, who, if needed, could find assistance in the area, but generally could survive this really harsh landscape. And so Operation Grouse with Skinnerland were this front team. They radio, they say tonight's the night, they set out lights, the weather changes as it does. The Grouse team can hear these planes, they're signaling them to come in, and then no gliders land. They think they have disappeared. They just decide not to let the gliders loose from the planes. But what turns out happening is that one of the gliders actually was released from its plane and crashed into a mountainside.
Oof.
Because they were lost. The pilots were lost. And the other thing about this Vita is that there are no lights anywhere. It's black. They can only do this at night. And it's almost impossible to read where you are. So the one glider crashes. The other plane crashes with its glider still attached into another mountainside. And essentially, about 80% of the men on board were killed by just in the collision. And then the remaining 20-odd men were captured by the Nazis, tortured for information on what they were doing there, and then executed. So it was an utter disaster in every imaginable way you could describe a disaster. Not only did all these men lose their lives, but now the Nazis knew that there was an intention by the British to come in and sabotage this plant. And so they doubled the guard, doubled the defenses. And the other issue is this grouse team now has to run because the Nazis are out looking for... The Germans knew the British needed some people on the ground who knew what they were doing. We don't know still if the men captured and tortured gave this information or they just implied it. So there was a massive hunt on the Vita for these Norwegian resistance members. And so the 4 grouse members went deep, deep, deep into the Vita to hide out, not sure whether there would be another mission or if they just needed to hold out for a little while.
So what happens then is they lose their element of surprise, right? Because the Germans now know this plant is a target. Well, they probably always knew the plant was a target, but they now know that there's this active mission to destroy it. And then they know where the saboteurs are hiding.
Right.
They know that there's an active resistance now in the Vita. So the stakes are higher now if they want to try to do another sabotage because the Germans know they're coming.
Right. Exactly. So Leif this time, Tronstadt, decides almost immediately after freshman, it was learned what happened. And so he goes to the powers that be at the SOE and says, I want to be in charge, for lack of a better phrase. I want to run this operation. I want to pick my men. They will be Norwegians. There'll be a 6-man team. They'll go in, pair up with the 4 of grouse, as well as Skinnerland, making 11. And those men would attack the plant surreptitiously and then escape. And so this led to what was called Operation Gunnerside, which was led by this young man named Joachim Ronenberg, who had no military experience. He was 24. He was a sort of natural leader, very good at cross-country skiing, but again, had never commanded men before in battle or on an operation. But Leif Tronstadt thought that he would be the sort of perfect member to lead this operation, which is pretty remarkable in its own right. And so they begin training, right, to prepare to go into the plant, know exactly where the entry points were, where the defenses were, all supplied by Skinnerland. They created a dummy plant in Britain for them to practice on where to plant the bombs. They created the supplies that they needed, the sort of heavy-duty sleeping bags to the skis, to the weapons, to everything. And it was sort of all prepared. And they also had to await the proper time to go, because this time they're going to parachute out of the plane instead of using gliders.
But all this time, the grouse team is still in the Vita.
The grouse team is still in the Vita. The freshman operation happens in the fall of 42, and they're in the Vita from basically from the start of winter through to early April 43. So 6 months.
How do they survive in this atmosphere?
Yeah, it's sort of unbelievable because one, they had no supplies, right?
Right.
They were living near the plant in various sort of huts that they've taken over. But now they have to escape. They go deep into the Vita, and they're in a one-room cabin that's, wood walls and a stove, but there's not much wood, and they have no food. And it's also the worst winter in 50 years. And the blizzards were unbelievable. And, fortunately, they were, as selected by Tronstadt, very good outdoorsmen and hunters. In particular, the leader of the operation, Jean Anton Paulsen, was just a superior reindeer hunter. And they essentially survived for that amount of time almost strictly on a diet of reindeer. I mean, at one point they were starving. They couldn't find a herd. There's this really incredible hunt that Paulsen takes. They get a reindeer, and now they're eating every part of this reindeer, from the obvious meat to what's in the stomach of these reindeer, because they munch on grass and lichen, so that provided some nutrients. The delicacy, the favorite part, was the fat behind the eyelids of these reindeer.
Ugh.
And so they were eating all of it. They were boiling the bones, and they were surviving these just horrific storms that were shaking the cabin. And at one point in time, for several weeks, there was so much frost on the inside of the cabin that the walls were closing in on them. And so they had to survive this many months, just the four of them in a one-room cabin. And they say of the 11, that was the toughest time of the mission. And it was essential because they radioed that Operation Gunnerside was happening, that the 6 men from that mission were going to land, but the winter was so terrible that they ended up having to wait until almost springtime, which is why this becomes, a sort of survival epic, and not really even a military operation for a good share of it. It was just survive the next day, keep all your digits, and keep your sanity, because this is winter in Norway. It's light out maybe 6 hours a day, and you don't want to be out in the dark. You can't find your way. It's very, very challenging.
Do people still go out there in the winter at all? Would anyone be out there if they didn't have to be?
No. I mean, people do. For instance, when I was doing research there, several years ago now, there was a team of British commandos whose sort of graduation ceremony or graduation test was to be landed in the Vita and make their way to Rjukan over several days and trying to survive those conditions. And so you were talking people who are supremely well trained, supremely well equipped with modern equipment, who can make a call on a satellite phone if needed, because there's certainly no cell service, and get help. They could not do that.
No.
Right? They were on their own with the help of Skinnerland, who ended up living in the cabin with them at a certain point in time.
So these men are starving. They survive the winter, and at some point they get the call that the operation is going to happen. Then they have to gather their strength and ski somewhere to the drop point?
Yeah, so the 6 drop in by parachute. They land, their gear's scattered everywhere, so it takes several days for them to find their gear in the snow that was dropped with them. They thought that they would be landing near the grouse team. The pilots were way off. So it took several days of skiing through this tundra to reunite with the grouse team, so that there's 11 of them, including Skinnerland. And then they, as a team, cross-country ski scores of miles to the Vita right across, to the slotted valley, across which is the fortress.
As all the men are going through these hardships and planning these missions, they know that they're sabotaging the Norse hydro plant. And they know that their target is the heavy water.
Mm-hmm.
Do they know why they are targeting the heavy water?
No, they do not. They're told only by Tronstadt that this operation could shift the path of the war. to one side or the other, and that it was absolutely critical and that every measure should be taken, including their own deaths. It was assumed that this was almost like a kamikaze mission, right? That they would go in and be able to blow up the plant, but they by no means were going to be able to escape and get to freedom. That was the understanding. They all had suicide pills, poison pills on them, cyanide pills. And like I said, the expectation was that this was a one-way trip for them. Get into the plant. It's so important that you're probably going to lose your lives.
Wow.
That was the mission that they accepted. And, the other part that's important here is, again, part of the reason that Tronstedt selected these men was because they had tangibly felt the consequences of Nazi occupation. They were from these areas and from these towns that had been taken over. And they were really felt like they were freeing their countrymen. It's a very local story in a strange way. They can't even contact any of their family people because that would be too dangerous. But that's who they're fighting for. And that's why they're there. And some of them didn't even believe that Tronstedt was just saying that this could change the course of the war because he wanted them to do a good job and to try to motivate them.
It worked.
It worked. Yes, it worked.
How do they gain access to the plant then?
So one night in late winter, they decided it's the only way into the plant is to go down the valley, cross the river, and then scale this 500-foot cliff in the dark that's frozen. Because they couldn't go around and then down by the water pipes because it was heavily guarded and there was also bombs everywhere in the ground. They couldn't go across the bridge. They may have been able to get across the bridge, taking out the guards, attacking the gates, but that was for sure a one-way mission.
Yep.
Because that would give time for the German army troops who were based in Rjukan to come up to the plant. And so they decide that the best way in, again, is down this Slaughter Valley, up this 500-foot cliff, which Ronenberg said later in life was like scaling a skyscraper in the middle of winter, and then go down those railroad tracks, which actually led from the plant along the cliffside, this sort of railway hugging a cliffside that goes down to Rjukan. They go down the railroad track, break into the plant there, and then access the plant through an air duct system that ran over the ceiling of the place. And that's exactly what they did. I mean, they managed to scale this cliffside. They broke through the lock. Half of the team sort of split off to be a cover, particularly for any escape. And then Ronenberg and 3 others went in through this air duct system. And again, they knew all this about the plant because of Tronstedt as well as Skinnerland. Like, they knew every lock on every door. They knew where the guards were. They knew which way the doors swung, where the air duct systems went. Like, they knew this plant inside and out. And so they crawled through this air duct tunnel, dropped down in the heart of the heavy water plant. There's a single Norwegian operator making sure that the factory is going because it's the middle of the night. They set their bombs. And the Germans never thought that anyone would ever get inside the plant, the heavy water plant, so they didn't have any guards there. And so just as lone Norwegians were like, it's yours, gentlemen. And they planned the bombs. But it's important to say that these Norwegian commandos, these SOE-trained Norwegian commandos, went in looking like British commandos. They were British fatigues. They were speaking English as well as sort of accented Norwegian on purpose, because what they feared was that the Germans would find out they were Norwegians and there would be repercussions for the population down in Rjukan.
Oh, so they really wanted anyone that they met to think they were English.
Exactly. They did not want anyone to think they were Norwegians. They're Norwegian-speaking British, I think is the best way of saying it. That's what they were intended to be. So they blow up this plant, right? And then they run like hell and burst through the door and rappel down this cliff. and then back up the other side, and then ski miles and miles and miles to relative safety. And another manhunt is started.
And this is a point in the book where it seems like you are making up this story. When you write about Klaus Hellberg.
I mean, the feats of endurance that these individuals performed is just incredible. Klaus went back to a cabin where they had stashed some weapons and explosives because he wanted to get them out. This is after the operation, the Gunnerside operation. And again, like I said, it's a huge manhunt on the Vita. In fact, the Germans were so fearful of this area because the terrain was so inhospitable that they didn't have any stations or any occupation of that land. And so for them to go into this area was pretty incredible. They recruited a lot of Austrians who were sort of skiers and set out to find them. And so Klaus sort of skied, I think, 30 miles to get to this cabin, and then arrives there to secure away the equipment. As he's doing that, he sees a German patrol coming towards him and begins this sort of epic cross-country ski chase through the Vita. Loses all but one of the skiers, who was an Austrian, up and down hills, just crazy. Then the guy shoots at Klaus. Klaus fires once, incapacitates him, and skis on. Into the night, falls off a cliff, breaks his arm or his shoulder, broke one pole, and then skis another 30 or 40 miles one-handed to a safe house. And then after that, if that's not enough, on his way to try to escape the area, he ends up staying the night at a hotel. And
he deserved at this point.
He deserved a rest and a bath,
right? Yeah,
right. He deserves a rest and a bath.
Absolutely.
He hasn't eaten. He's exhausted. He's been skiing for 36 hours, and lo and behold, the head of German security who's running this manhunt operation and his men come to this same hotel to spend the night. And they are rousting all the Norwegian guests to take over the hotel. And it's endless. Klaus gets taken on a bus, and then he takes over the bus and escapes out the door and skis, I don't know, however many 100 more miles to eventual safety. I mean, what's incredible about this story is that they thought it was a suicide operation, right?
Yeah.
These 11 men, every single one of them survived the operation and survived the war. That's not to say that they did not spend the rest of their life, and they did, coming to terms with all the horrors that they witnessed and experienced and people that were killed in the midst of all these operations to take out this heavy water plant. But they did survive. And it's a testament to just how incredible they were.
Absolutely. The Norwegians actually didn't rid themselves of the heavy water at this point. The Germans then rebuild the plant.
Yeah, the Germans, they're so desperate for this heavy water. Tronstadt thought the operation would set the Germans back at 18 months to 2 years, which he hoped it was long enough. Germans reconstituted the plant and had it running by the fall of 43 again.
That's amazing, the speed in which they rebuild the plant, but also says how desperate they were for the heavy water and how important they thought it was.
Yeah, I mean, they really were relying on this one path to a nuclear weapon. And the point is, people debate, how important was to sabotage this heavy water? And Germans were clearly sort of not putting their best foot forward in terms of developing this incredible weapon. But Heisenberg was sort of representative of that, right? He was sort of wishy-washy. But there was this individual named Dr. Kurt Diebner, who's really the person in charge of the German atomic war efforts. And he told the scientists very unequivocally that if they could get a heavy water reactor working, self-sustaining, that he would give them every single resource in the world to produce a weapon. And so they were hinging their bets on the heavy water reactor working, and then they were going to pour all this resources into the project. And it was the hobbling of that, by no means the most important part of the story of why the Germans didn't get an atomic bomb, but it was a significant factor.
You're right. And I also think that the debate on how important the heavy water was at the time, looking back, isn't really that useful because
Correct.
at the time, in the moment, it was extremely important.
It was, and the Americans or the Brits or the Allies, they had no idea what the Germans were doing, right?
Right.
They had no idea that they were hinging their bets on the heavy water. They had no idea that the resources weren't there or anything else. They were working in the dark and assuming the worst, which is, I think, probably how you have to lead a war. They thought this was mission critical.
Exactly.
I mean, Roosevelt and Churchill were together, and one of the things, that they talked about in Hyde Park in the early part of the war was 6 or 7 items that were sort of lead importance. Like heavy water was one of them. And this wasn't just a bunch of scientists and military operations guys saying, maybe we should take this out. It was Churchill and Roosevelt making this decision to go after this because they thought it was that important.
Yeah, if the leaders of the free world were saying it was important, it was important.
It was important, correct.
And the sacrifices that these men and civilians made were important for the war.
Yes, absolutely.
And I mentioned civilians because in order to rid themselves of the heavy water, there was one more mission.
Yes. So, as we mentioned, the Americans, the Allies bombed the plant in the fall of 1943. That is unsuccessful. It causes some damage, but again, not enough. The war in leading into 1944, the Germans decide we're going to keep producing. We're going to sort of evacuate all the heavy water we have and get it to Germany. And so Skinnerland is still on the ground providing intelligence. His story is remarkable. I think he's probably the longest running SOE trained agent in the war from basically 1940 to 1945. Like he was working.
Wow.
Operating underground. So he's providing all this information. So the Germans are going to take all this heavy water. They're going to ship it by boat, rail to boat, and then out of the country. And so Tronstadt believes, and the British believe, that they need to sabotage this supply and not give the Germans any heavy water. And again, they have no idea how important this heavy water is going to be. They just know that if the Germans get a bomb, it's over. Right? There's no question that Hitler will use a bomb.
Yes, and they also know that the Germans are putting a lot of emphasis on heavy water, which
Correct.
means it's got to be important.
It's got to be important. So that's exactly right. And at the plant, the heavy water plant, they put all this heavy water into steel barrels and bring it by train to this boat. Well, there was Newt Haukelid, who was the sort of second man in charge of the gunnerside mission. He was a experienced military officer. He had fought during the Norwegian War against the Germans, and then went underground and participated in that, and then went to England to be trained by the SOE. He's still in the area and is put in charge of sabotaging this ferry boat, which is really a sort of passenger ferry, the Hydro. And people from Rjukan take it to the other end of the lake, and that's how they get to Oslo and elsewhere. So people are taking this boat on a daily basis. It also delivers supplies to the town. Because again, there's no real road that goes through this terrain, through this valley. So Haukelid plans on blowing up this ferry ship. And he knows that really the best place to do it is once the ferry reaches the deepest part of the lake, sort of in the middle. He also knows that there will be many passengers, Norwegians, on this boat. And he has a crisis of faith over it, which I think any normal person would.
Mm-hmm.
radios Tronstadt and says, do we have to do this? Is there any other way? And there was no other way. Everyone was saying this, you have to do this. And so he was a soldier, and he went about executing this operation. Sneaks aboard the boat, sets bombs within the hull of it, and then escapes away. They're set to blow up at a certain time. They're on timers. The boat goes to the middle of the lake with all its passengers, as well as German soldiers and everybody else in it. It blows up. It punctures the hull. Boat very swiftly sinks, taking with it a majority of these passengers, very sadly, and all the supply of heavy water to the bottom of this very, very, very deep lake. And, again, the water is super cold. So those that managed to get into the water, many of them drowned before they could be saved by fishermen. So it's a very, it sort of ends in this very tragic operation that, really I think goes to the heart of the kind of sacrifices that war demands. And demands of not only soldiers, but also civilians. And I do know, having spoken with Haukeled's family, his children, that this operation tortured him for the rest of his life. People thought that it was unnecessary, particularly as hindsight grew clearer, and were sort of abhorred by the fact that he would have done this, that he would have taken this boat down. But if you look at from where he was and what his perspective was and what Tronstadt's perspective was, who was always trying to do everything in his power to prevent civilian casualties. He was not a sort of Patton or any other. He was cared a great deal about his people, and it was a hard choice, and he made it, and so did Haukele. And that sinking really put a stopper on any plans for the Germans. Like, now they had no heavy water. They'd have to create facilities in Germany because these Norwegians are too much trouble. So it was successful, but it was tragically successful.
Your book was the first time that I had heard the story, besides the brief mention in Making of the Atomic Bomb. Was this story known outside of Norway after the war, or was it a kind of local story?
I wouldn't say it was a very common story that people thought of. The first thing they thought of World War II. There was a Hollywood movie about the heavy water sabotage in the 60s or 70s. There was one other book about it, too, if you fudge it a little. But those were mostly written from, the movie was just, hilarious. Like, for instance, Newt Haugeland, the radio operator, was a woman, and, there's a love affair, I think, with Haukele, and whatever. But the books were based on sort of what the security services would reveal, even 20 or 30 years later. And then in the 90s, and then really after 2000, all these men, began writing about it, doing interviews, and all the papers were made available, both from the Norwegians and the British primarily, because a lot of it, sort of atomic secrets of what was happening in this period. And so that all came to light, which I had sort of first-time access to. And I think probably my biggest gold mine was actually Leif Tronstadt's son. And it's a story I tell because I still feel it when I think about it. Leif Tronstadт was sort of always in the shadow of his father. Leif Tronstadт ended up parachuting into Norway. He wanted to be on the ground. He wanted to be fighting. He had sent so many boys into harm's way that he felt like he should be there doing the same. He ended up forming this sort of underground army of 4,000 Norwegians, but then was killed by a Norwegian who was sympathetic to the Nazis. Never got to see his wife or his son and daughter again. His son sort of was always in the shadow of his father, who is a hero in Norway. And the son has created this legacy and a library of information about his father. Every single letter his father wrote during the war, all his diaries.
Wow.
Leif Tronstad took a diary note every day in code that his son then decoded. Papers that he shouldn't even have, he had. And I remember, I met with him outside Oslo, and we had a good conversation. And he's like, well, you should come to my apartment. And I went to his apartment and met his lovely wife. And then he's like, well, you should come back and see my library. And then I go back to his library, and he has this L-shaped wall of black binders that are full of all these letters, diaries. I really had a sense, probably more than any other character, of who he was, what he was fighting for, what were his daily travails, his fears, his triumphs, that were so rich that I'd have to be a fool to screw it up, right? That's what writers like me are looking for, narrative nonfiction writers. We're at our best when we know what people are thinking and feeling. Not only what they're doing, which is generally well recorded, but what the emotions were, what the fears were, and how they overcame and reacted to them. And I had that in spades with Tronstad. He is a key element of the story, but even more so because I can essentially write this operation through his eyes. And that was very powerful, I think. And I'm eternally grateful to his son for it.
Thank you for listening, and thank you to Neal, who took time out of his schedule to talk about this amazing story. He's got other great books too, so look him up. If you would like to support this podcast, the easiest way is to leave a rating or review on iTunes or tell a friend. For more ways to support us and to send us an email, visit our website, mynuclearlife.com. Until next time, I'm Shelly Lesher, and this has been My Nuclear Life.